For most of my life, my family had already decided who I was. They never announced it out loud, never sat me down for an honest conversation. They didn't need to. It showed in the way they spoke over me, the way decisions were made without asking my opinion, the way my name was followed by a pause, just long enough to signal disappointment. I wasn't the smart one, the ambitious one, or the successful one. I was the one everyone quietly agreed had fallen behind. The one whose life they explained away to outsiders with practiced smiles and half-truths. And the cruelest part was that they didn't think they were being cruel at all. They thought they were being realistic. At family gatherings, my role was predictable. I helped in the kitchen while others debated investments. I listened while cousins talked about promotions, houses, weddings, and plans that stretched confidently into the future. When someone asked me what I was doing, it was never curiosity, it was obligation. A question asked so they could nod politely and move on. Over time, I learned that correcting their assumptions only made them uncomfortable, and their discomfort always found its way back to me in the form of subtle judgment. So I stopped correcting them. Silence was easier. Silence kept the peace. Silence let them believe what they wanted. They mistook that silence for failure. What they never noticed was that while they were busy narrating my life for me, I had quietly stopped living inside their story. I took jobs they didn't understand and didn't bother explaining. I learned skills that didn't sound impressive at dinner parties but mattered where it counted. I paid attention to how people with real influence moved, how they spoke less, listened more, and never rushed to prove themselves. I watched patterns. I studied consequences. I learned that the loudest people were rarely the most powerful, and the most underestimated people were often the most dangerous when pushed far enough. Still, none of that mattered to my family. To them, I remained the same convenient comparison. The example used to motivate others. The cautionary tale. At least you're doing better then, my name didn't need to be spoken. Everyone knew who they meant. And I let it continue, not because it didn't hurt, but because I was waiting for the right moment to stop pretending it didn't. That moment arrived on an ordinary evening disguised as a family obligation. A dinner meant to celebrate something trivial, something they could post about later. The house was full, the table crowded, voices overlapping in the familiar rhythm of people who had rehearsed their roles for years. I took my usual seat, smiled when expected, nodded when spoken to, and stayed quiet when ignored. Nothing about the beginning of that night suggested it would end any differently from the dozens before it. That was exactly why it worked. Halfway through the evening, the conversation turned, as it always did, toward accomplishments. Someone mentioned a deal. Someone else bragged about connections. Laughter followed, comfortable and self-assured. Then, casually, someone said my name. Not to ask me anything, just to reference me. To explain me. To frame me for the room. A comment delivered lightly, almost kindly, about how I was still figuring things out, how I had chosen a different pace, how not everyone was meant for pressure or success. Heads nodded. Smiles appeared. The story was being told again, right in front of me, without my consent. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. The urge to disappear. The reflex to laugh it off. For a second, I almost did. Old habits don't die easily. But something inside me had shifted, quietly and permanently. I realized that if I stayed silent one more time, I would be agreeing to carry this version of myself forever. Not just in their minds, but in my own. So I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I waited. When the room settled and glasses were lifted, I stood up slowly, drawing just enough attention to pause the conversation. The change was subtle but immediate. People turned, surprised, curious, uneasy. They weren't used to me taking space. I smiled, not politely, not defensively, but calmly, like someone who knew exactly what they were about to do. I thanked everyone for coming. I congratulated the reason we were gathered. I spoke with warmth and restraint, giving them nothing to push against. And then, without accusation, without drama, I said the one thing that shattered the comfort of the room. I said that I had listened for years. That I had heard every assumption. Every explanation made on my behalf. Every quiet agreement that I wasn't enough. And that tonight, for the first time, I wanted to tell my own story. You could feel it then, the shift. The unease. The sudden realization that this wasn't another moment they could laugh through. No one interrupted me. No one joked. The silence wasn't supportive, but it wasn't dismissive either. It was alert. Watchful. And in that silence, I understood something important. They weren't prepared for me to speak because they had never prepared for me to matter. I didn't reveal anything yet. I didn't need to. Not then. I simply told them that the version of me they believed in was outdated, incomplete, and convenient. I told them that I had allowed it because it made things easier for everyone, including me. And then I said that the truth had a way of surfacing when ignored long enough. I raised my glass, thanked them again, and sat back down. The room didn't recover. Conversations resumed, but they were quieter now, forced, uncertain. People kept glancing at me, trying to reconcile what they had just heard with what they thought they knew. My family avoided my eyes. They didn't ask questions. They didn't challenge me. They assumed, once again, that this would pass, that I would return to silence, that nothing would actually change. They were wrong. Because that night wasn't about confrontation. It was about timing. It was about planting doubt where certainty had lived for too long. And it was about preparing them for what was coming next, something they could no longer talk their way around, explain away, or ignore. They had spent years letting everyone think I was a failure. They had no idea how close they were to finding out what I had really been building. That night didn't end with shouting or arguments. It ended with avoidance. People left earlier than planned, excuses suddenly urgent, hugs shorter, smiles forced. My family stayed behind longer, pretending everything was normal, pretending the air hadn't changed. But it had. Something I said, something I didn't fully explain, had lodged itself in their minds like a splinter. They didn't know what I meant, and not knowing made them uncomfortable. I noticed it immediately in the days that followed. Messages went unanswered longer than usual. Invitations stopped coming. Conversations felt cautious, like everyone was afraid of stepping on a hidden wire. My parents called me 2 days later. Not to apologize. Not to ask questions. Just to remind me, gently but firmly, that I didn't need to create drama at family events. My mother's voice was tired, defensive. My father stayed quiet on the line, letting her do the talking the way he always had. I listened without interrupting, without correcting her version of what had happened. When she finished, I told her calmly that I hadn't created anything. I had simply stopped pretending. She didn't respond to that. She said she hoped I would be more mindful in the future. I told her I hoped the same. What none of them realized was that the night of that dinner wasn't a reaction. It was a checkpoint. For years, I had been moving quietly, deliberately, building something that didn't fit into their narrow definition of success. I had learned early that if you announce your progress to people who don't believe in you, they either try to claim it or sabotage it. So I did neither. I let them believe I was stagnant while I grew in directions they couldn't measure. The truth was simple but inconvenient. Several decisions my family took credit for over the years had relied on systems I designed, advice I gave under other names, and structures I helped stabilize from a distance. I had been inside rooms they didn't know existed, listening to conversations they assumed were above my understanding. I never corrected them when they underestimated me because underestimation gave me access without scrutiny. And access, once gained, is far more powerful than recognition. The exposure they feared didn't come from me announcing anything. It came from consequences they couldn't control. Small things at first. A delayed approval. A deal that suddenly required additional review. A familiar contact who stopped returning calls. My family noticed these shifts separately, each assuming it was bad luck or coincidence. They didn't compare notes. They didn't imagine I had anything to do with it. Why would they? In their minds, I was still the one who hadn't figured things out. A week later, we were all at another gathering, smaller this time, more controlled. No speeches. No microphone. Just family and close associates. I arrived on time, dressed simply, the same way I always did. The difference wasn't visible. It was structural. Conversations slowed when I joined them. People listened when I spoke. Not because I demanded it, but because they were beginning to sense that the old story no longer fit cleanly. My sister watched me closely that evening. She was the first to feel it. She had always been sharper than the rest, more attuned to shifts in attention and power. She noticed when people stopped dismissing my comments. She noticed when someone asked for my opinion and actually waited for the answer. She noticed the way certain names reacted when they saw me. Her confidence, once effortless, became strained. She tried to reassert herself with jokes and reminders of her achievements, but the timing was off. The laughter didn't come as easily. Later that night, she pulled me aside. Her voice was low, controlled, but edged with something new. Fear. She asked me, directly, what I was playing at. I told her the truth, or at least the part she could handle, that I was done being used as a comparison. That I was done carrying a version of myself that made everyone else comfortable. She laughed it off at first, the way she always did, but her eyes stayed locked on mine, searching for weakness. She didn't find it. From that moment on, the balance shifted faster than anyone expected. Information surfaced. Decisions were revisited. Patterns that had been ignored for years suddenly mattered. And every time something went wrong for them, every time control slipped just a little, the same question began to form behind their eyes. Not spoken. Not admitted. But present. How much do they really know about me? They started asking around. Quietly. Discreetly. And what they found didn't match the story they had been telling. Pieces didn't add up. Timelines overlapped in ways that made them uneasy. My absence from the spotlight no longer looked like failure. It looked intentional. By the time they realized they should have asked sooner, it was already too late to stop what was coming next. Because the truth, once it starts moving, doesn't need permission. It only needs time. And I had given it plenty. The moment everything finally collapsed wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no public scene, no single sentence that people would quote later. It happened the way real power shifts always happen, quietly, all at once, and too late to undo. My family learned the truth in fragments. Not from me. Not from a confrontation. From the world responding differently to them. A meeting my father had waited weeks for was suddenly postponed without explanation. A long-standing partner stopped returning my uncle's calls. An agreement my sister had been confident about was quietly rerouted through someone else. Each incident, on its own, was small enough to ignore. Together, they formed a pattern no one wanted to name. They began asking questions. Not openly. Not honestly. Carefully. Strategically. The way people do when they're afraid of the answers. They asked mutual contacts about me. They searched for my name in places they had never bothered to look before. They compared timelines, revisited decisions, re-examined moments they had dismissed as irrelevant. And slowly, painfully, the truth emerged. Not as a revelation, but as a realization. I hadn't failed. I hadn't fallen behind. I had stepped aside on purpose. The version of me they had repeated for years wasn't wrong because it was cruel. It was wrong because it was incomplete. They had filled in the gaps with assumptions that suited them, and now those assumptions were collapsing under the weight of evidence they could no longer control. The final moment came at another gathering, months later. Smaller. Quieter. No speeches. No celebrations. Just necessity pulling us into the same space again. This time, the atmosphere was different. No one joked about success. No one compared achievements. The room felt cautious, restrained, like everyone was waiting for someone else to speak first. My sister arrived late. She looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing you've been standing on unstable ground without knowing it. She didn't greet me right away. She sat across the room, watching, calculating. When our eyes finally met, there was no contempt left. Only understanding. Later, she approached me alone. I didn't know, she said quietly. I believed her. Not because she sounded sincere, but because she sounded unsettled. The confidence she'd always worn so easily was gone. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't defending herself. She was acknowledging something she could no longer deny. I know, I replied. She swallowed. You could have told us. I shook my head. You wouldn't have listened. She didn't argue. Around us, my parents moved through the room like guests in their own lives. They watched conversations instead of leading them. They listened more than they spoke. For the first time, they were seeing the consequences of years spent deciding who mattered and who didn't. Eventually, my father sat beside me. You were right, he said quietly, staring ahead instead of at me. We should have asked. Yes, I said. You should have. That was all. No apology would have changed anything. No explanation would have repaired the distance. Some truths don't need resolution, they just need to be acknowledged. From that point on, things didn't explode. They settled. The world adjusted around me without announcement. Opportunities came without needing justification. People listened without me demanding it. I stopped shrinking my life to fit into conversations that were never meant to include me in the first place. My family learned to speak to me differently. Not warmly. Not proudly. Carefully. Respectfully. The way people do when they realize they misjudged someone and don't know how to fix it. I didn't punish them. I didn't humiliate them. I didn't expose anything publicly. I didn't need to. They had already done the hardest part themselves. They had to live with the knowledge that the person they underestimated, explained away, and quietly dismissed had been capable all along, and had simply chosen not to prove it until it mattered. And by the time they understood that truth, the story they had told about me for years was no longer relevant. It no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me.